Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I hope you all stepped out in the sun. It's absolutely glorious out there. And I'm buzzing to get started with this next bit. So up next, we've got Don't Relax, Culture, Protest and Music During the AIDS Crisis. This is going to be a conversation between Dr. Monica Pearl, who is a veteran ACT UP activist and a scholar of English and American Studies at the University of Manchester, and Gary Needham, who is a senior lecturer in film at the Department of Communication and Media School of Art at the University of Liverpool. So please welcome them.
Thank you very much. We want to say that we're going to have a conversation for a short time, and then we want to open it up to the room for questions and discussion. So please be thinking along the way of things that you either want to know, or indeed you might have experienced yourselves during that time of the AIDS crisis, and that's what we're going to be talking about mostly. So please do be thinking of things that you might want to share or ask. I think we're going to switch this now? Is that? Yeah. Oh, thank you. We'll turn it on again at the end so you can be reminded of the images and also of our handles on Blue Sky, which we're enthusiastic about. I just wanted to say for a moment that I was a member of ACT UP New York. You can probably hear from my accent that I'm a New Yorker. That's where I hail from, but I live in Manchester and I've lived here for a very long time. And one of the things that Gary and I were thinking about, especially watching those amazing performances just now, is that it might be worth talking about our experiences in that time of the AIDS crisis, but also between us, and Gary especially has an awful lot of knowledge about AIDS culture, especially having to do with music, and I have a bit of knowledge, more knowledge of the US than the UK, and I know Gary does as well, so.
Yeah, thanks, Monica. Yeah, I also grew up in the 1980s, and we were talking earlier about how much we were shaped by the AIDS crisis, and our lives are still shaped by the AIDS crisis, and in many ways the work that we do is constantly still coming to terms with the AIDS crisis and a working through of the AIDS crisis. And you've got to remember this, of course, is a time before the internet. And when I explain it to my students, I say, well, it was like COVID, but no one was listening. The government never mentioned COVID. They just thought, oh, just let them die. And I discovered music and film. Channel 4 were lifelines to understanding myself. And I was 16 when I volunteered at the Scottish AIDS Monitor in Glasgow, and what we participated in was harm reduction, which is what you see outside there, which is condoms, and we folded them in packets, and we took them out to the bars and the clubs, and in many cases people were like, oh, don't give them to us, as if it was an accusation. So there was still a lot of stigma even within the queer communities around AIDS work.
Yeah,
AIDS.
Yeah, and it was seen, a lot of harm reduction is seen as promoting the activity that it's trying to reduce the harm in. So I was involved, of course, in distributing condoms and making them available to strangers and friends, but I was also involved in doing needle exchange in New York. And of course, in both cases, it seemed like you were promoting the bad or dangerous activity by making that stuff available. And absolutely, it's very important to think about that time and about how, not only how much there was no information about and how little, not just the government cared about us, but how much even some people's families and the wider community, what was called the general population, didn't care about the lives of queers and drug users. But even queers ourselves had a kind of loathing and disgust about our own lives and existences and sexualities. And I think that's one of the hardest things to convey to young people now. Not that young people now don't struggle themselves with sexuality, of course, and what are people going to think, and how do I tell people? There's some of those same issues, but it's hard to convey how much one would feel that kind of loathing in oneself. One would rather be dead than to be queer. And that is what it felt like when the AIDS crisis erupted. So it was a kind of stigma on top of stigma.
Yeah, and I think that idea of sort of stigma comes out in the exhibition and some of the performances and discussions we've already had today when Holly Johnson discloses his HIV status in 1993 as a kind of anti-stigmatizing political act. Certainly, before then, just being out was in itself a political act. And one of the things that we thought about was how much emphasis today was placed on Holly Johnson's disclosure. He was diagnosed in 1991. He uses the press to come out in 1993. And this is actually quite a pivotal moment, actually, the early 90s going into the mid-90s. And one of the things we wanted to also get you to think about was in the 80s, it was very much a dying from. And when we get to the sort of mid-90s, it's a living with. A living with for those that were fortunate enough to have access to the combination antiretroviral therapies. But while recently there's a lot of celebration, there was a book came out recently saying 1984, the queerest year in pop, and we associate the 1980s and music with what they called gender bending back then, and there was Boy George, there was also Bronski Beat, there was a lot of queer, I mean, they didn't call themselves queer. This comes in through ACT UP.
That's right. It's gay and lesbian up until then.
People hated us calling ourselves queer, and there's some issues of gay times where they're like, oh, these young people wanting to call themselves queer. There was a real hostile response to us wanting to call ourselves queer back then.
Yeah, and it's worth saying, you might know this, but if you haven't thought about it, it'd be interesting to know that queerness, the idea of queer theory, queer nation, came out of AIDS activism, AIDS and AIDS activism. Because one of the things that we had to do as AIDS activists is we had to think about not what people are, but what people do, right? You have to protect yourself because certain behaviors transmitted HIV, not identities. So that switch from identities to behaviors in terms of what we were concentrating on and how people thought of themselves is exactly what queer meant initially, right? That anyone could do those activities. You didn't have to be a gay man to have anal sex. You didn't have to be a drug user to occasionally recreationally use drugs, right? You might not think of yourself with that label. You might be straight, but occasionally have the kind of sex that might transmit HIV. And you might be gay and never have that kind of sex. So it really mattered what you did in bed or with your social lives that might put you at risk. So it was about risky behaviors and not risky identities. And from that erupted the concept of queer and then queer theory, and now, only recently, has become a kind of umbrella term for all identities that are not hetero, right? Not normos, as I say.
Yeah, and I think that's what we see also in this sort of shift from Frankie Goes to Hollywood, which is gay-coded, and Holly Johnson, who reinvents his career as a queer singer. And you can see that sort of shift. And that shift from the kind of the out gay Frankie and the kind of Mapplethorpe light iconography and the censorship and the provocation very much belongs to kind of gay S&M subcultural coded world. But when he shifts in the 1990s and he reboots his career in a way and becomes Holly Johnson and becomes more central in speaking about HIV, that's that shift to queer. And really that, another way we often thought about that shift was our gay and lesbian elders were all about, they were coming out of the liberation and they were like, we want to just be like everybody else, we want to fit in. And we were thinking, well, you've been trying that for 20 years and it's not got us anywhere. So queer was very much about not gay as in happy, but queer as in fuck you. And the idea was, no, we don't want to fit in. We don't want to be the same with you. We want to be different, but we still want the same rights, and we need to fight for that.
And it was about anger, right? ACT UP was united in anger and trying to, and the AIDS crisis, and anger was very much a queer ethos and queer sensibility. And it's worth sort of saying, I probably should have remembered to include this in my discussion about just how loathsome it was to be gay at that time, is of course Section 28 was smack into the first few years of the AIDS crisis. So no sooner do you have the desperate need to talk about gay sexuality, queer sexuality, and suddenly you have the government saying that it's immoral and illegal to do so, that you can't preach or teach anything that is about the acceptance of, or the acceptance as a pretended family of homosexuality. But what Gary says about not wanting necessarily to be in families or to be monogamous, someone said in their performance that, you know, promiscuity is a good thing, and that was one of the things we were really trying to promote, you know, to be sex positive. And that was a real turning point, right? That being gay was not just about you wanted to have sex with certain kind of people that were unacceptable to the status quo, but that you wanted to do it in any way you liked and as much as you liked.
Yeah, and one of our most famous AIDS scholar, Douglas Crimp, who has passed, said our promiscuity is what saved us. Because promiscuity was a way of passing on education and information. Promiscuity was pedagogy, in a way.
That's right. Yeah, that's a nice phrase, yeah. Yeah, I think we need a button.
Promiscuity is pedagogy.
And we really also, of course, wanted to talk about culture, and this is something that's a great interest of mine, thinking about AIDS and HIV representation, whether it's writing or visual art or film or indeed art exhibition or indeed these live performances, amazing live performances that we saw. And this is how, I mean, this is, you know, sex is pedagogy, but art and culture are the ways that we not just pass down stories, but that we understand in the full breadth what it might have been like in the past. Because you can read history books, and I'm an educator, I believe in history books, I believe in knowing the actual facts and details and the dates. But there's something about a novel or a film or a piece of performance art or a beautiful poem or indeed music, music even without lyrics, as we heard, that gives you the feeling of the breadth of the immersion in the feeling of that time. And this is why when you see that money for the arts are being cut because the arts are frivolous or they don't matter, it couldn't be less true. But you have to also wonder how powerful the arts are, that those are the things that are defunded first, right? Education and arts are always defunded first because they're the most powerful. And so just thinking about the music and thinking about how this exhibition has led to this day of discussion and performance and meeting and exchange, art is very powerful, and in the AIDS crisis, it was essential because, as we keep saying, we didn't have the larger rubric of education, funding, medical care. It was all being done among and between us, whether it was passing a condom or writing a song or putting on a performance in a secret club.
Yeah, and unlike the US, we had one thing that contributed to saving our lives, I would say, which was Channel 4. And the place of Channel 4 in growing up gay and lesbian and queer or trans in the 1980s was an incredibly important source of education. It's not the Channel 4 you probably know now, but back then its remit was for black audiences, for queer audiences, for disability. And when we had no social media, it was the one outlet that wasn't the voice of Thatcher. It wasn't the voice of, as someone mentioned, Piers Morgan's The Sun newspaper. And if we go back to the exhibition, there are two texts that play off one another. One is a performance of Relax on the Tube, which was a Channel 4 music show, and the other one is a discussion of it being banned by the BBC. So there was a kind of culture wars over Relax and its kind of outrageous sex positivity. And music, like all other forms of art, was discovered to be an important tool of education, but also a tool of resistance. And in terms of the AIDS crisis, an important source of funding when there was no government money. So you'll see lots of concerts, events, people like Jimmy Somerville and Holly Johnson appearing at rallies, doing songs, charity music, from the margins to the mainstream as well. I'm thinking like there are some important figures you will no longer have heard of. Many died. Patrick Cowley, who gave us with Sylvester, You Make Me Feel Mighty Real, both died of AIDS. 1982 for Patrick Cowley, he was one of the first visible, famous queer music people.
Yeah, and Michael Callan, who American singer, sang with a group called the Flirtations, which is wonderful. And he also, along with Richard Berkowitz, wrote the first pamphlet on, it's called How to Have Sex in an Epidemic. And even before HIV was isolated, even before we understood how to protect ourselves exactly, they wrote a pamphlet about how to protect ourselves and each other, right? I mean, I think it's wonderful that PrEP exists now, but the difference between PrEP and sort of condom circulation back in the day, it was very much about protecting each other, right? It wasn't just about protecting oneself or ourselves. And of course, we're talking about men and women. You know, when you don't know how something's transmitted, well, then everyone is at risk. And when you do know, then everyone's at risk in particular ways. So a lot of men died. A lot of women also died. I know many women who died. And speaking of Jimmy Somerville and Bronski Beat, Jimmy Somerville came over to New York and did a fundraiser for us in ACT UP at the Limelight. So this kind of culture is partly about telling stories, but for ACT UP, it was a constant way of how we raise money to do our actions. And, you know, our actions, we needed T-shirts, we needed bail money, we needed money for all sorts of things. And art auctions and concerts were one of the ways. Diamanda Galas, who is a wonderful and important singer and whose brother had AIDS, and you could look her up and hear some of her shrieky, beautiful operatic music. She was an important part of the culture of the AIDS epidemic too.
Yeah, and Diamanda Galas, I mean, is kind of unlistenable, and I think that was the point. For those that know how she sounds. There was a kind of unlistenability to it. But I'm a big fan as well. I mean, Monica's mentioned a couple of figures that are probably more on the fringe, like Michael Callan, Diamanda Galas. But amazingly, one of the most important people to mobilise education was Madonna. And we know how big Like a Prayer was as an album, and the insert sleeve of the vinyl was safe sex education, how to use a condom, what is and isn't AIDS, how you catch it, how you know, all the important information about transmission. Because when governments like the UK government produced public media information about AIDS, it was always addressed to the general public. It was never targeted at the at-risk groups. And I think it was mentioned the giant concrete tombstone on TV, and then there was another one that was like an iceberg, and they were always between Coronation Street, you know, it was during the break of Coronation Street, and it was for the general public. We had to do our own work, and we also relied on people who we supported as famous acts, like Madonna, or in cinema, Elizabeth Taylor did a lot of work. And I guess in 1990, I don't know if you want to say about how important Red, Hot and Blue.
Yeah, Red, Hot and Blue, the first of a series of albums. The first one was famous singers, including Jimmy Somerville from Bronski Beat, and Sinead O'Connor, and Annie Lennox, singing Cole Porter songs. Cole Porter, who wrote some of the great classics of the American Songbook, doing their own versions of Cole Porter songs and then selling the album, and there were videos on MTV in order to raise money for HIV/AIDS. It's also worth saying, before we sort of open out to discussion and questions, that you know, originally we counseled in ACT UP against testing because there were no treatments There was nothing that would save you if you had HIV/AIDS. It was thought of very much as a death sentence. And worse, if you went for a test, your name might be on a list that would put you, this is in the US certainly, that would put you at risk. So until there were active treatments, and again, there is no cure for AIDS. There still is no cure for AIDS. I think that can be a real misconception. There's treatment that will keep you alive and well and healthy, but there's no cure. And now it's worth, of course, getting tested because it will save your life. But in early days, we thought it was a very bad idea.
Yeah. And I think just before we open it to the audience and to also bring it back to Frankie Goes to Hollywood, I want to share a kind of anecdote about going to see All of Us Strangers in the cinema, which ends on Frankie Goes to Hollywood's The Power of Love, which, of course, some people sung today, and it's been mentioned a few times today. And having gone to see that film by Andrew Haigh,
just in 2023, so
yeah,
really
just in
recent.
2023, and there is when he goes back in time, you know, there is some. They drop into conversation stuff that's clearly about AIDS, but it's very kind of casual conversation. But one of the things the film moved me around, and also what Andrew Haigh has said, is he made that film for a bunch of people whose childhoods were robbed by the 1980s. Robbed our childhood, and we grew up scared, afraid, thought we were going to die. In fact, when you were queer, you thought that just by being queer, that was your death sentence. Yeah. Yeah. And The Power of Love reminded me, or rather, I should say, All of Us Strangers reminded me that I still carry with me some of the melancholy of the 1980s. I haven't quite got over the 1980s, and I guess that's why we're sitting here, because we're shaped by, haven't quite got over, still working through the damage of
that's right.
surviving.
Yeah, I mean, surviving, you know, I always say, if you know any queers who are in their, I guess now, late 50s, 60s, or 70s, they have probably lost someone or many people in the AIDS crisis, and you should ask them about it. I think we have this amazing resource just around us, people who won't necessarily talk about it until you ask them. Maybe it's very painful for them, but I bet you anything they want to tell their stories. So they are survivors, and we have that resource everywhere around us. If you know a queer person who's a queer elder, ask them about the AIDS crisis. And I do want to say that time was scary, it was hard, it was devastating, it was tragic, it was miserable. It was also one of the most joyous times I can imagine in life. Being part of an activist community meant that we had immense solidarity, we had successes, we won so many rights and so many complaints against pharmaceutical companies, against governments, against hospitals, against the media. It was sexy, it was empowering, it was an incredible time. And I don't want to talk about how activism was so wonderful only in the past. If you want solidarity and sexiness and empowerment, as I like to say, if you feel like you missed out on that history and you wish you could have been part of all that, well, history is now. You can be part of it. Things are not all okay. We can't be complacent. Things our rights and our pride are being shredded all the time. So, you know, get involved. But you must have questions or stories or anecdotes, and we really want to hear them.
Yeah, and just to add, if you want to know about that, you should watch the documentary United in Anger, which is on YouTube, I believe.
Yeah, it is. United in Anger is a documentary that's the history of ACT UP New York, of the footage from that time, and using some of the ACT UP Oral History Project, which, by the way, if you're interested in oral histories by survivors of ACT UP New York, it's available for free online. You just look up the ACT UP Oral History Project, and that will take you to a couple hundred interviews with some of my comrades. Very moving material. Yeah. So.
And watch 120 BPM.
Yes. That's right. Yeah. We could make a list.
Yeah, we can give you a list.
Yeah. So I don't be shy. I know some of you aren't shy because I saw you on this very stage. So if you have things you want to add or talk about your process in making your performances, or indeed share any anecdote at all, or ask a question, here we are. Yeah, please.
I'm curious about the start of trying to convince people to take the condoms and actually start helping themselves. Because you said it was quite difficult, because if you were to take it, you would be seen as someone who was involved in that and there was no stigma. What was the process of winning those people over?
That's a great question. So what was involved in trying to get people to take condoms, use condoms, admit that not just that they were doing queer sex or any kind of sex, but that they might be in a position to need to protect themselves from HIV and AIDS. So that was, overloaded in that way. Some bars were known to have little dishes of them in the corner. I myself carried condoms on me in case I needed them or someone I knew needed them. A condom could be cut open to a dental dam, which for a while it was encouraged that lesbians should use those, or any people who are having oral sex should use those. So I was...
And drumming.
That's right. And, I also conducted safe-sex workshops at that time. So I was always explaining, if you do have sex and do take drugs, and I never said don't, when you have sex, when you use drugs, this is how you do it safely, right? Because people should be empowered to make their own decision. A condom is empowerment. You don't have to have sex if you have a condom, but if you have one and you want to have that kind of sex, penetrative sex, then you're all set to be protected. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, we invented safe sex because condoms were not associated with safe sex. It was reproductive health. So we repurposed the condom to save lives, in a way. But that was what I was involved in with Scottish AIDS Monitor, was packing up what you see outside into little cardboard boxes, one condom, one lube, and information on the inside of the carton that told you advice or how to use a condom. But you would be surprised at how much hostility as well was, given towards us. A lot of people were like, why are you giving us those? As if we were saying, you are HIV positive, you have AIDS, you're going to get AIDS. And in Glasgow, there was someone that was going round to gay clubs and gay bars where there were just like a kind of bowl of condoms, and actually going around with needles, stabbing them to try and exacerbate our deaths. Yeah. And no one found out who that was, but then we started having to take measures to give them out one-on-one, to make sure people were getting a condom that hadn't been stabbed by a needle.
And so while you were putting together packets of condoms and presumably safe sex information often, I was doing that also in New York, but I was doing needle exchange on the Lower East Side in New York, and I was doing one-to-one needle exchange. That's what we were allowed to do. We'd get a dirty needle, we could give a clean needle, because it was illegal to be in possession of a hypodermic instrument in New York City at that time. So one day we got arrested for doing that, and we did it purposely because we wanted to challenge that law. And, there's a story there. I can tell you it afterwards, or you can in fact go find the oral histories, not just mine, but of the people who did needle exchange. But that's what we did as activists. We were both distributing the material, the information, and challenging the laws. But you can imagine that needle exchange was really controversial because, again, it seemed to be promoting it for, don't give out needles. It will give people ideas. And there's always this idea, as you well know, the language of anti-gay and lesbian fervor and rancor of the time then is the identical language that's being used now against trans people, exactly the same language. And one of the main themes that is carried over is it's bad for children, save the children. And I always think, you think that homosexuality and queerness and transness is so appealing that a child only needs to have a whiff of it that they're going to be on board with it. I mean, it's like, think about that.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, please.
I was just going to say how moving it was hearing a lot of younger people than me engaging with that era and very powerful performances. And there's stuff about when I came out as a gay man in 1984, like AIDS was becoming more known about, still fairly new, and then that kind of morphed and joined up with the Stop the Toys campaign, and I was in that locally. I'm proud of that. So there was a lot going on, and that kind of engagement across the eras, I think, is really powerful and can fuel support for trans people and non-gender binary people now, perhaps a bit more working together.
Yeah, so you can really attest to that power of activism that was brewing. Yeah, but I agree with you, the performances just today, so powerful and so moving.
I guess I had a question about the Madonna having safe-sex things inside of album cover. I didn't know that, and that's amazing. But I can't imagine an American artist doing that about, say, trans rights now. Do you think there was more political fervor amongst those kind of people in the 80s and 90s? Or do you think that maybe people experienced a lot of backlash and saw that and won't do that now? Do you think that there has been maybe a decline in popular protest among celebrities?
Well, I certainly think the other person that was an agent in this was Cyndi Lauper. Both Madonna and Cyndi Lauper used their platform partly because they had so many close friends die from AIDS. They were part of queer scenes. Even now, Madonna is still using her platform to foreground AIDS. If anyone knows about her celebration tour, she used the Instagram AIDS Memorial to restage her track Live to Tell, and the idea that she was still living to tell, and her own adopted daughters from Africa, their mother died from AIDS. So she has this kind of through line in terms. And we often think of some celebrities as just being, just gesturing and being philanthropic for the sake of getting attention. But I do believe some of those, particularly in the 1980s, were so committed to saving lives because the government didn't. They left us to die and they were happy for us to die.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers the question.
But also, this is the thing about activism, is that if you were with a group of people, even a small group of people, one of the things that was true of ACT UP is that we learned through AIDS activism. You may have seen, if you've seen any images of ACT UP or AIDS crisis protesting, you've seen masses of people shouting and getting arrested. A lot of our activism was small groups of people doing small targeted actions in order to do zaps or small things to change things. You can make celebrities put trans, positive, life-saving material in their art. I mean, this is not just, oh, it was happening then and it's not happening now. We can work together to make that happen. I mean, by insisting on it. I mean, the more we live in a consumer society and more we live in capitalism, and I'm afraid we do, the more we have power in that way. We have to think of it as empowering. And the internet and social media is a way perhaps to organize, but going analog is the way to make actual change. So you show up, right? You show up, or literally you write letters, or you put stickers or stamps in the world for people to see. And the thing about activism that works is you come up with a goal. You want this artist to put this material in their bump, their material. And you work until that demand is met. So it is about looking at history and learning from history, but again, history is now. We can make change now. Does that help? Yeah, so let's do it.
I really appreciate how much we can learn today because of all the, this coming back to traditional values and the right and fascism in real time, and then not to mention genocide. And then you mentioned risky behaviors versus risky identities. And I feel like there's that shift to, all right, now that we're also going back to labeling so-and-so, especially queer people, as risky identities. So what tools or advice or skills like would you use to preserve yourself in the 80s into now so that you could be like a queer elder?
It's a great question. Do you have thoughts on that, Gary?
I just didn't have any sex. No. The other thing we didn't mention, actually, we mentioned Section 28, was the age of consent was 21 for men. Then they brought it down to 18 and 16. But yeah,
I mean, you know, consult elders. I was very young in ACT UP, and there were people. ACT UP's strength came from the women's healthcare movement and reproductive rights movement before that. We learned everything from them. ACT UP's success came from the collision of a lot of older women who had a lot of experience doing activism with the resources of middle-class, frightened gay men. That's how it worked. That's why it was so powerful. So, you know, find your knowledge and your experience, and then find the people who can might not even want to put their lives on the line, but will hand over the funds and hand over the resources, right? This is what we need. You need funds. The thing that allowed me to survive is, well, lots of sex, and most of all solidarity. And I can't speak too much about how powerful that is. It was life-saving at a time when we were also desperate and sad and going to memorial services sometimes once a week. You know, one of our strongest days of activism was a day in New York called Day of Desperation, where we were so desperate and so defeated, and in reaction to that feeling defeated, we needed to just do a very strong day of activism in response, right? Resistance is the key to feeling agency, to feeling empowered, right? Resistance. And you can see it happening now, right? The peace encampments going on, you know, all around the UK and in fact Europe and the world. That's made change. Not enough, but it's making change, right? That solidarity is important. And in terms of identities and behaviors, the powers will always try and pick us off by saying, oh, queers can marry now, but trans people are the problem, right? They're always going to try and divide us. And there are people who, once they get their rights, feel done, right? It's like, oh, I'm good now. I have my stuff. Well, good for you, but you have to pick up behind you, right? You have to continue the fight. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
I mean, I know it was a loaded question.
Yeah, it's a great question.
I think about it also because I'm, you know, by day, I'm a social worker in the NHS, and then at night I'm an artist, so I'm always trying to find ways I can resist without, like, completely burning out.
Yeah, of course. Right.
Yeah.
Killing myself, you know, like, that's the reality that a lot of us just relive it.
Yeah, but what's even better than self-care is care in a group, right?
Community.
Yeah, community.
Yeah. And I think me and Monica have not stopped talking about AIDS since the AIDS crisis. And although I don't really participate in much activism now, I do it through the classroom. I do it. I have a module.
Both indoctrinate through the classroom.
Yeah, basically, we recruit more queers. Yeah.
Turns out you can.
You can, actually. Monica was having lots of sex. I wasn't having any. That's because she was in New York and I was in Glasgow. So, I mean, there's no comparison, is there? But yeah, I mean, I use the classroom now to, you know, universities are very organised around getting kids into jobs and getting them indebted citizens. But I still feel the classroom is an important source of pedagogy. And every year I teach a module on queer media. And that is a real turning point for many students who feel not only seen by that, but empowered. They learn about history of the AIDS crisis, but they also get to think about the stuff that they want to participate in doing now, and they clearly make links between ACT UP and Black Lives Matter, for example. The way that ACT UP is quite closely aligned with second-wave feminism and reproductive health, like as Monica said, it was when gay men started dying. They relied on feminist activists to teach them how to organise, to protest, to stop partying and start acting. But The thing about ACT UP was
Yeah.
that it was both a party and
It was.
activism.
That's right. I mean, what are we fighting for except to have our dancing and partying and sexual escapades at the end of the day?
And that's why, if you haven't seen 120 BPM, which is about ACT UP Paris, it's a French film, the way it weaves between activism, clubbing, sex, death, family, queer kinship, it's the perfect example of that melting pot.
It is a very good film, and it includes women, because a lot of the histories now about that time leave out the women, and women were very, very present and very involved, and just, you can't do a history of the AIDS crisis without including women. And in fact, it's worth saying, sex became dangerous when HIV was on the scene, but sex has always been dangerous for women, always, through history, right? You were in danger of getting pregnant or getting a sexually transmitted disease, or in fact stigma if you wanted to have sex. So sex has always been a danger for women, and then suddenly it became dangerous for men, and very dangerous. I mean, I'm not dismissing that, but then it became an explosion of having to be safe about sex, and that's a good lesson, because we should be safe about sex. Safety is about mental safety, it's about physical safety, it's about, again, taking care of each other, but not saying no to sex, saying let's do it in a way that we protect ourselves and each other.
Yeah, and I know you said you were in social work, and one of the important parts of revising AIDS history is what I'm finding increasingly is more and more nursing. People are coming forward from the early AIDS wards and the early AIDS, because funeral parlours were turning people away. And there's been a big move to incorporate kind of oral testimony from nurses who worked in some of those early wards. And I think that's really been quite powerful, hearing their stories.
We might have time for one more comment or question if someone is holding back. Here's your moment.
Any music, any music, any activism, any...
Yeah, any question
any
or
more
story?
I want to share that in Venezuela, basically the AIDS pandemic carried on like for many, many years, even in the 90s, like late 90s, and my dad's co-worker and best friend, he died of AIDS because, and he wasn't even from the community, he was just a regular guy that happened to have slept with a lady from the shanty town, and she had HIV, and she contracted that to him. And even though it was late 90s, he should have survived, but he didn't because he was in Venezuela.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And I don't want to question the identity of this friend of your father's, but I trust this story, but there were a lot of people who, of course, said that they got AIDS or HIV from a woman because they didn't want to admit that they were having sex with men, right? So just to open that up to that idea. But it's important to say that there is medical treatment now for HIV/AIDS for those who can tolerate it and afford it. I mean, it's not a lifesaver for everyone in the world, and certainly when they first became available, those treatments, there are a lot of people who had squandered their tolerance on taking those meds individually and would no longer be protected from it. I mean, it was tragic, right? And again, still, it's about people who can access it, afford it, and tolerate it.
Yeah, and two things to add to that, Monica, as well, was once they had discovered that it had moved into heterosexual communities, the next target was bisexuals. It was like, oh, it's the bisexual husbands, or the bisexual women, or the sex workers that the husbands and men were visiting. And the other thing as well, to add to the kind of the drugs, the access, the healthcare, it wasn't, I mean, that recently that PrEP was framed again in the tabloids as this is funding gay orgies and denying pensioners cataract surgery. It was framed as, the boys are out having a party while your granny's eyes are getting bad. So they're still playing out some of these similar
that doesn't sound good.
Tropes.
Yeah. But thank you for your wonderful questions and comments. And we want to leave you with these ideas of the power of activism, the power of art, and the power of love.
The power of love. And, it's not a homo dystopia, it is a homotopia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.